online. You can find me at gemstate.substack.com. It's another beautiful day in the Treasure Valley of Idaho. And I just had a few things on my mind and thought I would share them with you this Saturday afternoon. Perhaps you'll find this enlightening or educational, or just a way to kill an hour or so, or however long it takes. Um, as I said, go to gemstate.substack.com to see what I've written so far. I was at the Capitol all day on Thursday and watched the special session from almost the beginning to the end. I missed the very beginning. They got an early start because they wanted to finish it all in one day, because as I wrote, it was a choreographed performance. There was no doubt as to what the outcome would be. The governor called the legislature into session to pass his bill, and they did, and they went home. So I guess that's efficient, right? Anyway, go there to read that as well as everything else I'm covering. Today I wanted to talk about friends and enemies. There was a German philosopher, political philosopher, Carl Schmitt, and he gets heat because he ended up being a Nazi at one point and was, he supposedly never repented of that, but that doesn't mean that the things he said were all incorrect. He recognized that the political distinctions come down to basically one binary issue, that being that of the friend and enemy distinction. You see, we, especially conservatives, like to think that we are part of this great discussion, this great debate, that we are engaged in the marketplace of ideas. And we all come and we share our thoughts, our plans, our ideas, our principles, and then the best ones win and we move forward. And that's not the case. Was it ever? Maybe. But really, all politics is today is deciding who your friends are and who your enemies are, and then using political power to reward your friends while punishing your enemies. Now, the left understands this, and they have for some time now. This latest, the student loan forgiveness by Joe Biden is exactly that. He's rewarding his friends at the expense of his enemies. Obama, 10 years ago, when he was running for re-election, told a Hispanic group that they needed to vote for him to punish their enemies. That's something that I think the left intrinsically understands that the right really doesn't want to admit. We don't like this idea. We don't want politics to be a war. We want politics to be about discussing ideas. You've heard Republican politicians say that for years, that it's not about the people, it's about the issues. I don't want to get involved in mudslinging. I don't want to run a negative campaign. I just want to talk about the issues. And then once they get into power, they want to they do their best to appear objective. The idea of using government power to help their voters seems wrong to most Republicans. So that's why the Democrats say, can we forgive student loans, or can we, do DACA to bring in more Democrat voters? And the answer is yes, of course. That's what we're here for. Meanwhile, Republicans get into power and they want to pass tax cuts that, that's what they do every time. Republicans think that their base is big business and the military industrial complex. So the Republicans get into power and the first thing they do is, pass a tax cut, starting at the highest level, and then, engage in some foreign war that enriches the coffers of Raytheon and, all those other companies. They don't like the fact that they are beholden to people like us, just regular people, regular families. You see what other countries are doing, like Hungary, offering tax incentives and in order to promote family growth, to promote people having children. And here we don't really have that. Anyway, the thing about this distinction, the friend-enemy distinction, is it's only becoming more important because we are engaged in a civil war. And that sounds maybe over the top. It sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. We don't have two sides fighting each other in the streets, at least not yet. And, with any luck, it won't come to that, but it's increasingly likely. But it is a cold civil war. I often come back to Curtis Yarvin's formulation of democracy as a war where two sides show up to the battlefield, but instead of shooting each other or fighting each other, they just engage in a head count, see who has the most. And that's what voting is. You go to the polls and you see who has the most support. And we like to think that going to the polls or a political campaign is about convincing people to vote for you. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to run for office, I'm going to tell all these people who are completely undecided, they are just objectively analyzing the situation in a rational manner, and I am going to convince them that my ideas are better than my opponent's ideas. That's how politics works in the Platonic ideal, somewhere off in the ether. In real life, on the ground, it's about turnout. I'm coming in as a Republican, and I know that there are this many Republican voters in my district, and this many Democrats, and this many unaffiliated. I want to get all the Republicans out to vote. I want to get the unaffiliated ones who I know are going to vote Republican out, and I don't want the Democrats to come out to vote. And so, like this whole special session, the whole point of it was to supersede or to obviate this Reclaim Idaho petition, um, the one that would raise taxes in order to fund education. That was going to get Democrats to the polls. And so I can see the political calculation in the governor and the legislative leadership going and taking care of putting money into education themselves so as to say to the Democrats who would have otherwise voted, look, we took care of it already. Now you don't need to go vote for this initiative. And hopefully that will keep the Democrats from going to the polls. And they still want the Republicans to go to the polls. It's a war where the victory is determined by head count. So we are in a kind of cold civil war where it's no longer so much about convincing people in the middle as it is just getting more people on your own side, gaining friends and diminishing your enemies. And understanding that distinction is important because there are some people who are ostensibly on our side who are not our friends. Some of them are our enemies. Some of them haven't chosen their sides yet. It's like, in the last couple pieces on my Substack, I've criticized the governor for the method by which he's gone about doing this special session, and I've criticized some of the House and Senate leadership. However, I'm doing that from within the Republican Party. I'm doing that as a voter, as a Republican, as a PC. I'm not saying that they're my enemies. I'm saying, I wish you hadn't have done this way. I would like you to do things differently in the future. And I don't want to burn my bridges. I want to be able to work with these people. The primaries are over, so these are our guys for the next 2-4 years, however long. And so I want to be able to have influence and to help them, to move them in the direction I want them to go. There are some people who claim to be conservative that I would not trust. People who would probably stab me in the back at any given moment in exchange for a pat on the head from the left. And you'll see these. Sometimes they come across as concern trolls. If you say something remotely controversial, they immediately jump in and say, oh, well, have you thought about how this comes across? Maybe you should double check your tone. Are you sure you want to be saying this? That sounds kind of racist. That sounds kind of sexist. That sounds kind of homophobic. And so they'll come in as concern trolls. And obviously, concern trolls are almost never acting in good faith. And they play this game where they try to get you to disavow people to your right. Oh, you were interacting with that guy. Well, he's a known racist. He's a white nationalist. He's said some things that are not politically correct. Are you sure you want to do that? And so they'll get you to disavow, and then eventually they'll get someone to disavow you. And eventually everybody to their right is completely disavowed and canceled. Do you ever see the left doing that? Do you ever see the left denouncing Maxine Waters for calling for people to go intimidate, conservatives in the streets? Do you ever see the left disavowing Ilhan Omar for all the things she's said? The only time she got even remotely pushed back against by her own party was when she said that Jews were controlling the country. Have you ever seen them disavow even outright violence like Antifa and BLM? No, they don't. They let those people do their thing. For a leftist, they have no enemies to the left. And as conservatives, we need to have no enemies to the right. Now, it's of course entirely reasonable that if we disagree with someone, we go and work it out. Maybe somebody is saying something that is outright racist or awful. Well, tell them that, but don't publicly cancel them, because that just feeds into the left. That just feeds into what they're doing. They're trying to get you to shoot your own soldiers before the war begins. Yeah. Imagine if the Allied troops are lined up on the beaches of England, getting ready to cross over into Normandy in June of 1944, and Hitler sends a message saying, some of your guys, they're not quite morally upright. You need to get rid of that guy and that guy, and this general and that general, they're no good. Patton, he's too abrasive. You should fire him. That would be absurd, and yet conservatives do that all the time. It's because conservatives don't understand the friend-enemy distinction. I think a lot of people on our side are unaware of what time it is. They think it's still 2014, or we're just on the verge of returning to 2014 before Trump came in and just made everything so divisive. Rather than recognizing that our country has been growing more and more divided, and Trump came in and was really the first politician to speak to that divide, they like to say he's the one who caused the divide. They think that we're maybe just on the verge of going back to 2002, when neoconservative was at its peak. George W. Bush had 80% approval ratings. We'd been attacked on 9/11, but here we are. We're going to go defeat those terrorists, and everything's going to be okay. They want to go back to 1984, Morning in America. Ronald Reagan is president, but even though Reagan is president, he has this massive mandate from the people. You still have Democrats in Congress, but Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they get along together, so everything's okay. We're all still Americans. It's not that time anymore. We've passed that point. I often go back to the 1960 presidential debates between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Those two men had a lot in common. Now, they had a lot that distinguished them as well. Kennedy came from a rich family. Nixon came from a poor family. Kennedy came from Massachusetts. Nixon came from the West Coast, from California. They both served in World War II in the Navy. They were both officers in the Navy. Nixon could have gotten away with not enlisting. He chose to. Kennedy, he came from a rich family. He didn't have to go, but he did. So they both chose to serve their country. They both chose to serve in a way that put them in danger. It's not like both of them were stateside. Obviously, Kennedy was a Democrat, Nixon was a Republican, and they came into this debate. Nixon actually had more experience. He was the vice president. Kennedy was a senator. And so they debated, and they had differences of opinion. They had different views on how America should be, how much money we should spend, how much oversight the government should give, how much we should help the poor. But they generally both agreed that America was a force for good in the world. Both Kennedy and Nixon believed in America. They both believed that as Americans, that there was more that brought them together than separated them. They both believed that in the Cold War, the struggle for global supremacy, that American Christian capitalism was superior to godless Soviet communism. And so they had more that united them than divided them. Last year, when Bob Dole passed away, I remember reading that he and Daniel Inouye had both been injured in World War II at around the same time, and they'd both convalesced together in the same hospital, and so they got to know each other. They became friends, and obviously, Dole was from Kansas, Inouye was from Hawaii. They both became senators, and they both served in the Senate at the same time. Dole, the Republican, Inouye, the Democrat. And so they would have had debates, and they would have had serious disagreements about things where they came down on opposite sides of issues. And, perhaps these issues were intractable, but at the same time, they had that shared experience. They had that experience of both of them fighting for their country against fascism, against Nazism, against totalitarianism, both being injured, both recovering together. And so when they're in the Senate, even though they might have serious disagreements, they still have that shared experience. They still have that shared background. And that is what a culture is. Culture is a shared background, a shared heritage. And that's what America once had. No matter whether you were left or right, Democrat or Republican, you still came from the same place. You still had things in common. And we increasingly do not anymore. We increasingly have a divide in our country that is, people on the left and right at this point have very little in common. We are polarizing, we are separating. It's happening ideologically. The differences between the Republicans and the Democrats over the last 20 years have gone starkly wide. Really, the Demo- the Republicans of today are still further to the left of Republicans 20 years ago. So we still have this leftward current in our culture. But the Democrats have been falling much further left. It's totally off screen over there. So ideologically, our divide has not been greater than it is now. Geographically, we're starting to divide. Where red states are getting redder, blue states are getting bluer. The COVID lockdowns really accelerated that division. It's not quite so geographically distinct as it was before the Civil War, or the first Civil War, as they're someday going to call it, but it is starting to grow. And conservatives and liberals they just live differently now. And we have completely different views of the world. We interpret current events completely differently. They see Trump as the next Hitler. We see him as a populist. They see what's going on in the administration now as a good thing. We see it as the encroaching tyranny. Consider the Democrats today. You've all seen this image. This is the Democrat Party today. This is what America's become today. This is the leader of the Democrat Party, the President of the United States. Now, we all know that he's not really running the show, that he's addled and probably senile, but this is who they've chosen to be their standard bearer. This is what the left is today. I'm not sure what else I can add to that. Joe Biden, in that speech the other day, called MAGA Republicans a clear and present danger to American democracy. Now, remember what they mean by democracy. When someone like Biden or his speechwriters say democracy, they don't mean a democratic system of government where the people cast their votes and the majority, wins. They don't mean the voice of the people. They mean their view of how society should be. When a Democrat says democracy, they mean when Democrats win. Now, I posted that video on a previous piece about how Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin at the time, had been facing a recall. And all these young protesters were at the Capitol, so excited they were going to oust this evil Republican fascist Nazi. And he ended up winning. Not only did he win, he actually gained votes from his previous election. And so the news interviewed this young college-age guy, and he says, democracy died tonight. Now, we look at that and see the extreme irony of somebody saying that democracy died when what really happened is that democracy was in action. People cast their votes, and a guy that they didn't like won. But remember, they've redefined the word, just like they've redefined everything. To them, democracy is them winning. They believe that history is naturally progressive, that they are on the right side of history because history has a bias, that history is moving in the direction of their left-wing utopia, whatever that form may be, and that anyone who stands in the way of that is not only anti-democratic, but turning back the clock, standing athwart history. And so when they say democracy, they mean their view of how society should be. Even if they were only 10% of the population, they would still say that democracy was on their side. Here we have Joe Biden calling Donald Trump a threat to democracy when latest polls show that Trump is soundly defeating Biden if they were to face each other in 2024. So we can laugh at the hypocrisy, the ridiculousness of Democrats saying that it's only democracy when they win, but this is deadly serious. They have control of our society. They have control of the FBI. They have control of the CIA. They have control of big tech. They have control of the entire federal government. So it's not so silly anymore, is it? All that matters at this point is which side are you on. If you're a Democrat, this is your guy right there. This is what you represent. This is whose team you're on. It doesn't matter if you're trying to avoid controversial issues because you're trying to get elected in a red state. Crystal Ivy, Shelley Brock, Terry Pickens Manweiler, Ilana Rubel, Tom Arkush, Stephen Haidt. You can go on and on about how you're a moderate. You're not extreme like those Democrats in California or New York. You don't want to talk about the controversial issues. You just want to talk about what's affecting the people of Idaho. You just want to talk about common sense stuff. No, this is your guy. You should be asking yourself, every Democrat in the country should be asking him or herself right now, are we the bad guys? Is using the FBI to target our political opponents, is that what bad guys do? Is passing laws to censor speech? Is using big tech companies to censor speech? Is that what bad guys do? Of course, very few are going to ask that because they don't see things that way. They think that they're the good guys, and so anything they do is by definition good. But consider, it's not just Democrats. Any Republican, whether at the state or federal level, who still thinks in terms of bipartisanship, of reaching across the aisle, you're supporting this too. He's your guy. When the governor smiles for a photo op, when the president visits Idaho, this is what you're supporting. So whose side are you on? They call us extremists because we don't want unborn babies to be brutally murdered. They call us extremists because we don't want children and teenagers mutilated in the name of transgender ideology. They call us extremists because we believe that children deserve a mother and a father. They call us extremists because we want schools and libraries that have materials that are uplifting and educational, not indoctrinating and grooming. They call us extremists because we believe in free and fair elections. They call us extremists because we believe the purpose of the American government is to take care of the American people. That is what counts as extremism today. Really, the extremists are the ones on the left, the ones who oppose all those things, who are destroying every definition, every structure of society, whether it's man and woman, mother and father, the innocence of childhood, the sanctity of life, the belief in free and fair elections. They are the extremists. They are the ones who are on the extreme, but they are pulling the train. They are pushing the narrative. As I said, they control basically every facet of government and society right now. And so when they point to us and they say, you're an extremist, you're a MAGA Republican, you're a domestic terrorist, you're an insurrectionist, you're a threat to democracy, we need to take them seriously. These are the words, this is the rhetoric that comes before genocide. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here. They have declared us their enemies. So how many Republican leaders are going to make some statement denouncing Biden's speech and then move on to try and do some bipartisan gun control or immigration reform? They don't, our Republican leaders, many of them don't really believe that the Democrats are serious. They don't really believe that things are as bad as people like me are saying. Anyone who understands history knows that Biden's speech the other day is a precursor to persecution. He has just said that 75 million Americans are enemies of the state, enemies of the people. They're milking everything since January 6th, 2021, as an excuse to crack down on political opposition. It is their Reichstag fire. Remember, Hitler had just gotten into power in 1933, and he was actually democratically elected. His party had a plurality of the votes for the Reichstag, the parliament, and so the president appointed him as chancellor. And then suddenly the Reichstag burns down. Now Hitler says it was a communist agent. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It doesn't matter. It was the response that mattered. And the response was to outlaw political opposition and to give himself emergency powers. And the rest is history. Before too long, he was the supreme leader of Germany and was embarking on a war that was going to kill tens of millions of people and forever alter the shape of our world. People who would end up being persecuted in that country, some of them saw the writing on the wall in the early 1930s, and they knew it was time to leave. At what point is it time to leave our country? When you see speeches like this? The FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago was just the beginning. They are going to indict Trump. That is certain. They want to prevent him from running for president. They want to do everything they can to keep him out of power. But they also want to see him in prison just to fulfill their own tyrannical ambitions. And remember, Biden in his speech denounced political violence as if it's coming from the right. They want to hold up January 6th as the only example of this in our country. But consider that they've been engaging in political violence for years, the left. 2020, Antifa and BLM. Dozens murdered, cities burned, billions of dollars in damage. The Democrats excused that. They believe it's okay. 2017, Trump's inauguration. They rioted and vandalized and assaulted. They got off the hook. In fact, the government was forced to pay them damages for having dared to arrest them. Maxine Waters calls on her supporters to go out there and intimidate and harass conservatives in public. Somebody tried to assassinate Justice Brett Kavanaugh because he dared to want to overturn Roe v. Wade. Kamala Harris raised money to bail out rioters and get them on the streets so they could riot some more. Democratic mayors and governors all supported this violence. You see, it's not hypocrisy. It's easy to call it out and say, look how hypocritical the left was. If we call out their hypocrisy just one more time, then maybe we'll win. That's not how it works. It's that they justify anything done against us while defending anything they do. Go back to the friend-enemy distinction. Anything their side does, anything they and their friends do, is justified. Anything we do is not. There was a political philosopher, James Lindsay talks about him all the time, named Karl Popper, who created this concept of repressive tolerance. You see, coming out of World War II and the horrors of the Nazis, these philosophers were trying to figure out how the Nazis got in their power in the first place and how they can stop them next time. And so he came up with this concept of repressive tolerance that said that in order to keep the Nazis from rising again, we need to crack down on anything on the right. The right should not have free speech. The right should not be able to propagate their ideas because that's how you get Nazis. Meanwhile, the left, we need to allow them to do everything. We need to allow them to have as much free speech as they want. We need to allow them to have as much violence as they want. So they believe that they're on the side of good. They believe that they're the good guys, and so anything they do is by definition good. And we're the bad guys, so anything we do by definition is bad. That's why it's a mistake to try and engage these people rationally, because there's no common ground here. We have completely different definitions of reality. In their view, there's nothing we can do that is good because we are inherently evil. And in their view, there's nothing that they can do that's bad because they are inherently good. And so we need to quit trying to hold them to standards as if they had standards. We need to quit trying to meet them halfway and get them to see reality as we see it because they don't see it that way. They understand that they're in an existential war. And so they will justify anything that their side does in the name of that war. Our only choice is to do the same. We've got to stop disavowing people, stop canceling people who are a little further to the right than us, We need to stop thinking that strongly worded statements and letters and Twitter posts that call out the left's hypocrisy are doing anything. They're not. We're just whistling past the graveyard. They think that Trump and anyone who voted for him are literal Nazis, literal fascists. You have the president's press secretary calling 75 million Americans fascists. Now, these terms are basically meaningless. When the left calls us Nazis or fascists or racists, when we call the left socialists, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a pejorative. These words, I saw a great Twitter thread. I'll try and dig it up later about how we use these words because these are the last vestiges of our previous society where we understood what the words meant. We had a common ground with which to have discussions. And so, all these things come from the 1920s and 30s, socialist, Nazi, fascists. They have no bearing on what's going on today in our current battle, but they're thrown around because they're the last remaining thing in our cultural memory. We all know what they meant, or we all know what they represent. Really, more because of movies than real history. At this point, it's really no different than, if the left called us Sith Lords or Dementors or Sauron and orcs. It has the same meaning. They're just words used to say you are on the wrong side. They're words to identify whose team each is on. They're words to identify and distinguish friend from enemy. So don't take the left seriously when they call you Nazi. Don't try to explain yourself or justify yourself. Just know that they are identifying you as a member of the out group. You are the enemy, and act accordingly. In any case, if they really think that Trump and all his supporters are these evil people, what wouldn't they do? Do you think they'd steal an election to make sure that Trump and his supporters were not in power? If they truly believed that, do you think they would exaggerate or even make up a violent incident to justify a crackdown on us? If they really believed that, do you think they'd have any qualms about locking us up preemptively, putting us in prison? Everybody's heard the thought experiment. Would you go back in time and kill Hitler as a baby? Well, they think we're all Hitlers. What would they do to us? What would they justify? You know the answer in your head and your heart. So consider what time it is. It's not 1984, Morning in America. It's not 2014, the last vestiges of the American Republic before the fault lines were obvious. We're at Russia in the 1910s. We don't realize we're on the verge of our own destruction. We're Germany, 1932, enjoying the wild hedonistic times of the Weimar Republic with the collapsing economy and the Nazi menace on the horizon. We're China in 1948. Yeah, we've just won World War II, come out on the side of good, defeated the Japanese, and we're about to fall to communism that's going to kill hundreds of millions of people. If you live in a blue city, it's time to leave. But if you live in a red state, it's time to support elected officials who understand the gravity of the situation, who know what time it really is. We need elected officials. We need leaders who are not going to compromise with this. We need leaders who understand that this is an existential threat to America, and we need to do what we can to protect America wherever we are. Here in Idaho, that means we're going to have to start disentangling ourselves from the federal government. That means saying no to federal taxpayer handouts. It means disengaging from all the Byzantine regulations that the federal government places on us. It means we're going to have to take a stand when the federal law enforcement, such as the FBI, starts doing things that are blatantly unconstitutional. If the federal government's not going to uphold our Constitution, which is the guarantor of our rights, then our states are going to have to. Because this is where we are today. This is what time it is. You need to know who your friends are and know who your enemies are. I am definitely not telling anybody to go out and start shooting in the streets. Please do not interpret this to mean that. I am saying we need to know who to trust and who to not trust. We need to stop giving our own self proclaimed enemies the benefit of the doubt. And we need to stop with this nonsense that says if we just elect the right person, we can go back to the way things were. There's no going back, there's only going forward. So I think that is something that is doable. But we just have to have a clear eye as to the gravity of the situation. We have to understand our context, understand the world we live in today. And then we can move forward. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. After talking at such a high level here, so apocalyptically, it might seem jarring to then come back down to earth, but that's what we need to do. This battle is not some, fantastic battle of good and evil, Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings that happens at some high level. This is in the trenches, and the trenches are your communities. You need to get involved in your communities to keep them conservative, to make them more conservative, to make them protect the values that you believe in. Get involved with your city council, your school board, your library board. Get involved with the state legislature. That's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be going there as much as possible and keeping you informed and trying to, disseminate as much information as I can. I'm going to do my best to hold our elected officials accountable. And when they go astray, then I will let them know and I'll let you know. And when they do what's right, we need to let them know as well. Politicians are like puppies. You need to smack them with a newspaper when they do what's wrong, but you need to reward them when they do what's right. And eventually they'll get the picture. So don't disengage. This is not the time to go out and buy a cabin in the woods, as tempting as that sounds. This is the time to keep fighting in our communities because, the war has already started. And so we need to make sure that we protect what we have. What we have is, here in Idaho, we're not in a bad situation. We complain about a lot of stuff, but we're a lot better off than San Francisco, or New York City, or in many of those states that are ruled by those blue cities. So we will keep fighting here so that we can protect what made America great in the first place. You have a good Labor Day weekend, and I will talk to you again soon. Stay tuned at gemstate.substack.com. I will be posting more. Subscribe here to the YouTube channel for when I do things like this. I've got another interview with a local candidate coming up next week, so stay tuned for that as well. I will see you then. God bless you all.